three times in the history of this country I want to talk about. First of all, the American Revolution. That put a lot of Anglican priests in a very, very weird situation. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. I also would like to just briefly touch on the Civil War, because that was a war that, do you realize that that war touched every single family in the United States? There was not one family that wasn't touched either by a death or wounded or what they thought or what they were against. I mean, it covered everybody. It really did.
And sometimes the family had people on both sides.
That's right. Yeah. And sometimes if they weren't touched directly, they had a friend, that was affected, etc. And the third part is the civil rights movement in Vietnam. And that's a part where I could even have some personal experience. So I want to share some of that. So anyway, let's look at the Anglican Church in the colonies. Mostly on the Eastern Seaboard, the Anglican Church was one of the things about the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is that if you're a priest, the head of the church is the king or the queen, the monarch. So part of your ordination is you have to swear allegiance to the king or the queen. So this really put the Anglican priests in especially those years right before the revolution and during the revolution, in a really weird spot. I mean, how can you pray for the king if you're in rebellion? What are you supposed to do? And this played out in a very, very strange way. The first the first bishop ordained in the United States for the Episcopal Church was Samuel Seabury. Okay, he was ordained Bishop of Connecticut in 1784. In 1774, 10 years before that, he was a very leading loyalist in New York City, pro-British, anti-revolution. In fact, he would write public letters under the pen name A.W. Farmer. Are you familiar with those letters at all? I miss Phyllis. Phyllis would probably be able to quote all kinds of stuff. But what those letters were was justifying the loyalist position. And who took him to task was Alexander Hamilton. And so he and Hamilton forever dueled with each other. Excuse the pun. But they were always, going back and forth. And then also it's important to look at the things that come after this too. Seabury was a slave owner in Connecticut. We always think slaves were just in the South, but that's simply not true. It was all along the Eastern Seaboard, and Episcopal clergy, a lot of them would have slaves. Anyway, the second bishop elected in the colonies was William White, and he was a moderate revolutionary. He was a good Episcopal bishop, You kind of look at both sides of the issue, and he was moderate. He was the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia, and immediately after his ordination, he was appointed to be rector of Christ Church when the loyalist rector left. Because he was a moderate, he got elected to be rector. That's how he ended up there. Then he was elected bishop in 1787. He had 3 African-American coachmen in his household. But he said, they're not slaves. They receive monetary payment for their services. In other words, they are provided with room and board. But they're not slaves. And it's interesting because William White was ordained by English bishops. He had to go back to England to be consecrated as bishop. Samuel Seabury, who was the loyalist, went back to England, but they wouldn't consecrate him. So he had to go to the non-juring church in Scotland, and the Scottish bishops consecrated him as the first bishop in the colonies. So it's really interesting. The one that's more moderate, was ordained by the English. The one who was certainly not moderate at all was ordained in Scotland because the English wouldn't do it. It's fascinating. In 1786, Samuel Provost from Trinity Church, Wall Street. Have you ever been to Trinity Church? Yeah. Yes. And he was an avid person who was in favor of the revolution. The only problem was Trinity Wall Street and the rector were loyalists. So and plus, as one historian said, his dry preaching style, along with his support for American independence, offended church members. And in 1769, something very, very odd happened. The vestry of Trinity Wall Street resolved that Mr. Provost be continued and paid by what can be raised by subscription only. So the church wouldn't pay him.
What's that mean?
It means what you could raise from some members of the congregation, that's what your pay was, but you're not going to be paid as a staff member of Trinity Church, Wall Street. And so that lasted for a whole 2 years, and then he resigned because nobody would contribute. This is the interesting part. The rector of Trinity Wall Street during the American Revolution was Charles Inglis, and he was an ardent loyalist. He was a loyalist. Now, when the war ended, and you had these soldiers that started coming back to New York, back to church at Trinity Wall Street, they didn't want him as a rector, right? He's a loyalist. And so what they did was he had assigned his assistant minister, Benjamin Moore, to be the rector. But what they did is when these people who had fought in the war objected, and within a short period of time, like 8 months, they installed Provost as the new rector, and they kicked him out. They didn't actually kick him out. No, I can't say that. What they did is they made him the associate rector under Provost. Isn't that interesting? Because, and the thing that amazes me about this is the fact that the sides were so blurry. You know what I mean? I mean, here's a person who's assigned as a rector, who then becomes the assistant rector under a pro-revolution rector. Wow, isn't that kind of a switching around? I mean, how's this supposed to work? And this lasted, but the Anglican Church in the United States, in the colonies, was always seen as a pro-English church. They were pro-English. And whereas most of them were on the border, and actually a slight majority toward the revolutionists, which I find that very interesting. I wanted to read you this little piece because I thought this was really excellent. In the wake of the American Revolution and disestablishment, because see, these Anglican churches were supported by the English crown, right? So I mean, they had money, they had support. And this article says it all but collapsed, as most of the clergy fled back to England. Former communicants deserted in droves to other Protestant churches. So it fell to the lot of those victorious evangelical denominations of the 19th century, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Baptists. They're the ones that wrote this history. Isn't that interesting? And here's what they said. They talked about their former competitors, short shrift, portraying Anglican parsons as a despicable lot of incompetence, time servers and wastrels who neglected the spiritual needs of the colonial laity while indulging themselves in drink, dance, and other unmentionable forms of dissipation. But this is written by the Baptists and the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. This is the way it was until about 50 years ago. That was the history that was written about the Anglican Church in the colonies. And they used to call them nominal Christians. They said, you know, the people who went to the Anglican Church were nominal Christians. When they bothered to attend worship, they did so out of duty or fear rather than any real spiritual conviction, as written by a good Presbyterian, Baptist, or Congregationalist. And those same stereotypes came all the way into the 20th century. That's what you would have read if you were reading about this 30 years ago. That's not exactly the story, because there's been quite a bit of research done on this. In fact, Phyllis is one of the ones who's done some of that research on the colonial church. And now there's a bit more of a balance. And I wanted to just share with you what that balance looks like. First of all, the population in the colonies, all the colonies, about 20% went to church on a regular basis. 20%. Apparently, Anglicans weren't the only wastrels. And it also talks about nowhere is there evidence in the American colonies that membership of the Church of England was restricted to elite, well-to-do merchants, planters, and lawyers. That simply wasn't the case. There was a cross-section of people in those congregations, just like there was in the other churches that I had mentioned. As for Anglican laity, the ordinary men and women who were communicants in that church appeared to have been no less committed than other Protestants to regimens of frequent family prayer, Bible reading, and moral exhortation. But it's interesting how people get portrayed, isn't it? And then how historically we pick up on that and we kind of say, those are the elites over there. They're the ones that do it. When I was in Salem, PA, at Church of the Redeemer, if you ever want to see a beautiful church, go to church. It's right across from Robert Packer Hospital. Go to and see the inside of Redeemer. It's absolutely stunning when you walk inside. Stunning, stunning, stunning. And the reason, well, I won't tell you the reason. I was there kind of helping calm a troubled situation. But what I was going to say about it is one of the curious pieces that they share with me was the original vestries there were all made up of the wealthy. And when they had bills for the church, they just handed them out at a vestry meeting. And one would say, I'll take the electric, I'll take this, I'll take that. And that's the way it was done. And that became their heritage. So that was what was always expected. Even when I was there, they looked at the vestry as being well-to-do, which they weren't necessarily, but they were certainly seen that way. Does the vestry here, is there a bit of that underlying some of the way people see vestry here? Huh?
No,
Used to be.
Handing out wealth.
Huh?
You said handing out wealth? Is that what you said?
They handed out the bills.
Oh, the bills. Okay.
We take turns.
We take turns.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
And anyway, so some of that still persists to this day. Still persists. Let's see. Oh, and there's a couple of books that are wonderful books that you might be interested in. One is called Patricia Bonomi's Under the Cope of Heaven, and another called John Butler's Awash in a Sea of Faith. And what those are overviews of the church in the colonies. The priests in the colonies were in tough shape. They were. They caught themselves in betwixt and between. And, on the one side here, this is your living. So you have to follow the rules. This still persists in the Episcopal Church. Let me tell you why. A priest, if they choose to go to work outside the church, has to get permission. Has to get permission from the bishop to be allowed to work. Talk about control.
Yeah.
And that still persists in the church. It most certainly, and it's used. If in fact, there's so many things in the canons, and the change in the canons has given bishops even more authority to be able to do all kinds of things, which they weren't even allowed to do before. So what happened to the Anglican Church after the Revolution? Well, actually, yeah, there were some people that left, but most of the members that were members before them stayed. There's been a revolution, there's been a shift, okay, but this is our parish, this is where we stay. And we have to remember that the history that was written about them was written by Protestants. So, as if the Episcopal Church isn't Protestant. But anyway, the second era that I want to go toward is the Civil War. And are you familiar with, go ahead.
When did the term, other than I guess Thomas Jefferson, come about? He worded it such, but he never used the exact words, separation of church and state.
Mhm.
Did some of what you just discussed, as far as the clergy and the English and the loyalists versus bad rebel terrorists, did that have something to do with it, do you think?
Oh, sure. Yeah, if the colonies don't want to have a king, then you would have a hard time being an Anglican, because the king's the head of the church. And what the colonies did not want is they didn't want that being a constriction on the life of the people in the colonies, right? So you have, and what's really interesting is what we understand the separation of church and state is often not very accurate. What that separation is simply says that as a country, we cannot establish a church like the Church of England and basically force everyone into that group. You can't do that. Well, okay, we understand that. Does it have to do with a lot of the other things we put in the midst of that? Not really. It just says you can't establish a church for the whole country, which is exactly what they did in England, which we're pushing back against. How many of us have heard of the Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America? Are you familiar with that?
No.
When the Civil War began, actually almost right before, the bishops and laity, but certainly the bishops in southern states that seceded, said we can no longer worship with our northern brothers and sisters. And so they created their own church. And they called it the Episcopal Church of the the Confederate States of America. It lasted until 1865 when the war was over, and then it just dissolved, and everybody went back to the Episcopal Church. Now, I have to tell you this: if you look at the prayer book for the Episcopal Church, Confederate States of America, it's almost identical to the Episcopal Church of the United States of America. So isn't that interesting? You can separate yourself in name, but the fact is you're identical. So you have to deal with the others one way or another. And so it's almost kind of, it's by name only that you're separated. Something more serious than this happened, of course, after the time that Gene Robinson was ordained as a bishop. And that is that the Archbishop of Canterbury refused to invite Robinson or any of the gay clergy to Lambeth and said that there was a break in communion. Well, this made it more prior to this time. If you were gay or not gay or whatever, everybody still gathered together. But then he made a statement by doing that of where he stood. And I remember I had a parishioner when Gene was elected. I knew Gene, wonderful guy, wonderful guy. And when he was elected, the woman came to me and said, I want you to stand against Gene's consecration. And I said, no, I'm not going to stand against it. I think it's perfectly fine. And she said, I just want to let you know, I'm writing the bishop and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I said, well, you have a really good time. Because my bishop at the time favored Gene Robinson as well. So I don't think he'll be surprised. And the Archbishop, I think, could care less what I had to say about much of anything. So the split in the Episcopal Church during the Civil War was really more name than it was in reality. You know, you still have friendships, you still have all these things happening. There was a much deeper divide when the Archbishop of Canterbury would not invite Gene Robinson to that was a much deeper divide.
What about the issue of African Americans, the slaves in the churches? How much did that, carry over in terms of the Southern churches?
Yeah. Well, it's really an interesting thing because in Southern churches, although they were the great majority was white, there were blacks in the Southern church. But they weren't, there was segregation. So they most certainly weren't allowed in the same shoes as the white converts. And that was very obvious. In fact, the first African American priest who was ordained, that started from I think it was a church in Philadelphia, and they too were segregating blacks into a different part of the church. And so the blacks finally said, that's enough of this. So they got up and left. So what happened was the bishop ordained, a priest for them, and they became, first, I should say, before they became Episcopalians, they became what's called the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Right. And the AME Church, you still have one right over here. And then later down the road, had more people in the church. Today, the majority of the Anglican communion is black. It is not. Anyone who says it's a white church is pretty ignorant, because all I have to do is look at Lambeth and see all the wonderful different colors of faces. It's just terrific,
And there's women.
And women.
No, you're talking on the planet, right? You're talking on the planet,
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And in this country, I'm not sure what the ratio is anymore. Like, for instance, even women to men for bishops. I think it's pretty close. I know all of the recent bishops who've been elected, almost every one of them
Are women.
And there was a time, even in my ministry, where women weren't even allowed to be priests.
Uh-huh.
Now they can be bishops. Yay! I was always for them. So the Episcopal Church in the Confederate States included the Diocese of Alabama, Diocese of Arkansas, Diocese of Florida, Diocese of Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. In that quick list that I read, Are there any obvious omissions?
West Virginia.
Huh?
West Virginia
Didn't
wasn't.
exist
Yeah.
until after the,
West Virginia, huh? Yeah, and that was after the Civil War when
yeah,
it
they
became
broke
West
up
Virginia.
Virginia after that.
Yeah. Yeah.
North Carolina?
Huh?
Did you mention North Carolina?
Yes.
Yeah,
Carolina.
Oh,
but there are some obvious omissions. Tennessee,
Tennessee.
Kentucky, all those border states,
Oh, yeah.
right? None of them joined the Confederate Church. And there's one notable exception too that you don't have on here. The Diocese of Louisiana never joined the Confederate Church. Interesting. Interesting.
Catholic there.
Go ahead.
Just to clarify, you talked about the Revolution, the Anglican Church.
Mhm.
When did the Episcopal Church of America get established? Prior
Right
to the
after
Revolution?
right after the Revolution.
So right after the Revolution, the Anglicans basically became Episcopalians, or is that what you're saying?
Basically, yeah. In fact, yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, that's been brought to courts not that long ago. And here's why: because when there was disagreement in the church over women in ministry, over gays in ministry, and all that, you had a split in the Episcopal Church, and some of them went under the ecclesiastical authority of African bishops.
Right, you know.
And so what happened was, since some of those churches in the Eastern Seaboard, I'm thinking like in Maryland and so forth, in South Carolina, they filed suit and said this church was Anglican before it was Episcopalian. So we have right to the land, we have right to the buildings as Anglicans. And they wanted to kick the congregations out. And this went to court. I don't remember how that was ever resolved. Do you, John? I
Yeah,
don't
I think it was resolved on the Episcopal side. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that the bishops, in fact, did have the authority over
Yeah.
all of those churches.
Over all those.
But it was complicated because some of their charters,
All right.
and Falls Church, for example, go back to the English times.
Right.
Didn't that just happen over here on the south side too, about
Yes, it
15
did.
years ago?
Well, I don't know if it was with deeds and stuff with the church.
They weren't able to keep the
Yeah,
property.
but they weren't able to
Yeah,
keep
well,
the
the
building.
property is now in Islamic mosque.
The church sold,
Right.
I mean, the Episcopal diocese sold it
To the
to the Muslims, right?
yeah, and they got 50,000 for it. They're asking
Right.
$500,000.
I tell you, it gets complicated after a while. Whose side you on for what,
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to the era that.
Barbara had it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I
Bob.
have a question. I have a 1948 hymnal back in the dark ages
Yep.
when I sang in the choir, and it says Protestant Episcopal
Church.
Church.
Mhm.
So when was that dropped?
I can't hear. I'm sorry.
When was Protestant dropped?
Oh,
When was
at the,
Protestant?
at the very beginning,
Uh-huh.
when the first prayer book was chartered, the church was called the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America, MACUSA. And they dropped that to the Episcopal Church. If Sandra Michael were here, she could tell you the year because she was at the General Convention when they dropped it. But now it's known as the Episcopal Church. They don't use the Protestant. So, anybody else on that one? I want to go toward an era that I think everybody in this room remembers pretty well. If you want to talk about the 60s and early 70s, and the unrest over the Vietnam War, the unrest over civil rights. Does anybody know where the Episcopal Church stood on Vietnam?
Didn't it depend on the clergy? In the building?
I
Weren't they
suppose.
against the war? No?
There was no resolution ever presented
Yeah.
for or against the Vietnam War.
Oh, my
Oh, I thought they.
Now, I find that, and let me explain to you why that is. Because, let me explain to you why that is. Because the Episcopal Church has always been very proud that it was via media, middle of the road. And so you honor people who were on one side of the debate or the other side of the debate. And so the General Convention could never agree to have a resolution either for the war or against the war.
May have been the best thing.
Maybe. And so where did the Episcopal Church stand on the civil rights movement?
They had to be against it. They had to be against it.
There was never a resolution in
Oh
Geneva
my God.
talking about the civil rights.
See, this is.
In fact, the Bishop of Alabama, who actually confirmed me, and some of you have heard this story, and so I apologize if I say it again. Bishop Carpenter was one of the clergy in Montgomery that wrote the letter to Martin Luther King Jr. that prompted King to write the letter from the Birmingham jail. Because this group of clergy, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, Episcopal, etc., asked King to step down, to stop protesting, stop creating this furor. And King read this letter from these clergy and wrote the letter from Birmingham jail. And he talked about if there's no justice, if there's no justice, how can you have a peace? He really took them on and did a beautiful, beautiful job with that. I have to share with you a personal story that I didn't find out until I talked to my mother. This was way after I was ordained, so it probably would have been the 1990s. I was a part of the Church of the Holy Comforter in Montgomery, and this was obviously after I was confirmed, but or no, what it would have been before. Anyway, what she told me was, we were talking about this one day, and she said, "You don't know half of the stories of what was going on." He said, my father was a warden at the time. God bless the wardens, And he said, here's what happened. He said Bishop Carpenter called all of his priests because there was a time when blacks were coming in carloads to join worship in white churches. And he said, I want you to position wardens and vestrymen on each corner. And if you see cars with blacks coming, you're to let the rector know, and he's to disband the service. That's an Episcopal bishop.
Yep.
I was so disgusted. I almost right then said, you know what? I rescind my orders. Go find somebody else to do this. And so it was awful. But nobody knew what was happening, I mean, he would tell his priest that the priest didn't make it public. And the only reason the vestry and wardens knew about it was because he had to say that from the bishop, But that's the kind of stuff that was going on.
Yeah. Well, Barbara Oldwine told our Sunday school class, we were just teenagers then, that when she went to the Washington Cathedral, she was refused communion because she was black.
Because she was black.
Mhm.
Man,
It's true.
what a different world. But I hope we can stay in this different world. You know what I
I
mean?
don't know.
I hope we don't have to go back to those kind of things. There were other things. The Episcopal Church is always, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Would you repeat what the bishop told the wardens to do again?
Sure. They told them to post basically observers. And if they saw cars with black people coming to attend church, they were to let the rector know, and he was to disband the service. So there would not be any service going on when they arrived. So I just think it's awful. And I probably was worshiping that day, and I never knew it. I mean, who else would know it? But there was never any resolution for King either, for Martin Luther King, because the church couldn't agree. This is still going on today. Still going on today. Not just in terms of race, but in terms of we want to invite both sides so that we can somehow figure this out. And so when you looked at the Bishop Booty, was that who preached the sermon and made everybody go crazy. The Episcopal Church never did recognize her sermon, as saying, yeah, we stand with her on this, because they believe in via media. They're going to take both sides.
It's always politics.
I think it comes within a certain period of time where sooner or later you got to make a decision, as to not to be throwing anybody out or doing anything like that, but you have to make a decision on where you stand. Otherwise, then what was it somebody once told me? No, it was King that said it. If you don't do anything, what you are is part of the problem. You're
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
people.
If you're not part of the solution, you are the problem.
And King said something, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was a marvelous, to not decide is to decide.
Yeah.
You can't always just sit back and say nothing.
I think a piece too is money. I always thought that you couldn't use your collar to preach anything political, taking sides, okay?
Right.
Because it's supposed to be separation of church and state.
Right.
Supposed to be. And if you were to do anything to proclaim your political stance,
Mhm.
that you would no longer be tax exempt. So
Yeah.
it's money.
Yeah.
Put the clamps on your lips.
Yeah. And I don't think that's entirely true.
Oh.
Or all of the nationalist churches, Christian nationalists, would not be tax exempt, and I'm sure they all are. You see, so it depends on who wants to clamp down on who.
Who you are.
Yeah, I mean, in our tradition, we have always said, or at least as far as I know, let's put it that way, we have always said we're not going to favor one party over another, right? I'm not going to stand up in a pulpit and say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican or you should vote this way or you should vote that way. I mean, Christian nationalists will do it in a heartbeat. But go ahead.
There was a case, in fact, with national implications, maybe 20 years ago or so, with a very fundamentalist church that was telling people who to vote for. I think it was vote against Obama. And they did get caught up and disestablished by the government because of what they had done, because they explicitly, were backing a candidate. So that does happen at times, but probably not now.
And what Bishop Dede has told us, and she's been very clear about it, she said, you preach the gospel. If the gospel people take that message in and say, you know what, this really stands in opposition to a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing going on in government, so it stands in opposition. This is like the early church. This isn't anything new. She said, I'll always back you if you're proclaiming the gospel. So, I mean, preach Jesus, you're good. Start preaching Democrat, Republican, you're going to get yourself in trouble. And I totally agree with her. I totally agree with her. And there's been some real difficulties in this diocese and a few congregations over that whole issue. And that's the way it goes. One of the things that I also wanted to bring up, why were why was the Bishop of Alabama upset about King's marches? And I think there were two reasons. Number one, it wasn't orderly. It created fervor in the community. And that's what he didn't like. And I think the second thing with Bishop Carpenter, he was a white supremacist. I don't think there's any question about that. He was. He confirmed me, and I'm very, what are you going to do? I was a kid. I didn't know that. But he did not believe, if you were raised in the South like I was, you knew slavery was over. You knew that even after there had been initiated integration and all those other things, there were still blacks who were not allowed in positions. They were kept in their lower positions, servants, whatever. They were kept in that position. That's how Carpenter understood the world. That's how he understood it. And that's one of the reasons I simply, even to this day, I can't go back into the South. It would make me crazy. And Bishop Dede took a group down and they went through Alabama and went over the Pettus Bridge and all this kind of stuff, which I commend them. I think that's great. I've lived in it. I don't want to go back to it. The last time I went back to it, it still existed. In fact, here's what happens with the schools. The school I went to, high school, Jefferson Davis High School. I can still sing the alma mater. I remembered it.
It's still the same name?
Yep. And there were 4 high schools in Montgomery. There was Jefferson Davis. There was Robert E. Lee.
Yes.
There was Sidley Lanier. In between. George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. Guess which ones were white and which ones were black.
I can't fathom it any different.
Yeah. To this today, the realty has changed. So the high school I went to, Jefferson Davis, is primarily black. It has had funds withdrawn from it. And those funds have been transferred over to new schools that have been built in white areas, which are charter schools, so that they can regulate who comes into the school. And so,
Funds were withdrawn at the state level or the local level?
oh, I don't know.
Are you talking about now?
Yeah.
Or
Oh yeah. Right now, what happens is once you understand society as saying it's us and them, you try to maintain that. And that's what they do, but they're maintaining it in kind of a backdoor way, and it's really, really quite sad. And how do you confront that? I mean, the Episcopal Church has tried to confront it by confronting racism, but I got to tell you, a lot of Episcopalians, I don't think, buy into it, unfortunately, because they've never lived in it. They don't understand, what it is, what white privilege really is all about, because we're all a part of white privilege, so many of us. That's the same way I know in my church, when you talk about Vietnam, they would never take a stance against the war. You want to know why? Because 90% of the congregation worked at Maxwell and Gunner Air Force Base. So they would never take a stance against the military. They just wouldn't do it. And the church still has that polarity that it's constantly having to address. What do you do with the military? What do you do with wars? If you'll remember, the presiding bishop during the first Iraq War, remember the presiding bishop marched against the war, and he had all kinds of opposition to him. How dare you stand? And as he said, I'm trying to stand on the side of peace. No, you're making your politics known. We should remove the Episcopal Church. They try to do all these things. So it kind of hinders you from even making a statement of the gospel. I mean, it's a very dicey situation, but it's not new. They've been doing it ever since the colonies. They've been doing it ever since the early church. You say the wrong word against Caesar, you're done, right? And I mean, so you still have to play that game, that field. which I think is terribly sad because it's not what the church is about. Church is about all of us, no matter what color you are, what sexuality you are, what none of that stuff. I don't know of any that are ins and any that are outs, other than belly buttons, maybe. But and I had one more thing. I had one situation that happened in North Platte when I was there, and that was that a woman came up to me and she said, "Can I receive communion?" I said, "Of course you can." You know me. She said, "Well, I'm a Lutheran." And until you came, I wasn't allowed. I wasn't allowed as a Lutheran to receive communion. I thought, oh my God. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was thinking as you were speaking that what is the common thread of all religions, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Buddhism, Judaism, everything preaches basically kindness, love, right? Most religions, that's what it's all about. People go to churches, to synagogues, to mosques for peace, for faith, for hope. And yet, what are wars fought over? Religion, right? And this has never ceased to amaze me that people use religion to go to war.
Yeah.
What happens to, love thy neighbor concept? And if people do not speak up, I understand where you're coming from because of the politics involved, where you're not supposed to say certain things because it's politically incorrect. But if people don't take stands, if we did not have the Martin Luther Kings, where would we be? And I think now we need more Martin Luther Kings because now we're in very perilous times. And, I know you cannot take political stands like a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, but there are issues. It goes beyond parties. Like we're in serious peril, I think, right now in the United States. I think our country is under siege, really, with this so-called president that we have, who should not be there. And no one is taking any kind of stance to say, this man is doing these terrible things, is putting us in peril. And if people don't take stands and say, I want to be politically correct and not ever say anything, we're going to have people like Trump all the time.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous.
Yeah. John, were you going to say? Oh, Teddy, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
John and then Teddy.
I was just going to suggest people online might not have been able to hear Vivi entirely.
Oh,
If you just sort of summarize it.
That
All right.
you can't always not take sides.
Well,
And that
you can't be always politically correct if you really want to take a stand. That's why I was saying we need more Martin Luther King, because he was not afraid to say what was happening. And right now we are living in very perilous times. And if we don't take stands, and people are showing up, you can see that. They're showing up at town meetings because they're disgusted with what's happening. And they feel like they have no sense of power at all. Because what's happening is this side of thinking is taking over. In every area, the media, it's being lambasted. And I fear for the country, frankly, because, if this continues in the manner that it's continuing, and the other side of it is what's happening worldwide. I mean, I hate to see the news every day when I see over 50,000 Palestinians, for example, being slaughtered. For no reason. These people are innocent people. They come from a poor country. They don't have a rich, big country backing them. So they're being swallowed up as if their lives don't even matter. This is very serious stuff.
I agree. It is serious.
People can't just sit back.
Right.
I mean, there have to be certain stands that people have to take. And it can be apolitical. It's one of those things where you don't have to be a Democrat, you don't have to be a Republican, you just have to have the principles of what life should be all about. As I
Yeah,
said, I
right.
use religion. Why do we go to war
Yeah.
over religion?
Yep.
Look at all the wars that were fought over religion.
Amen, sister. I'm with you. Teddy?
There's a book that Daniel bought from a neighbor who was living. There's a whole library of them. But there's one particular one on business. It was written in 1911. 1911. And in one of the chapters there, the man stated the mind of an American. I'll bring the book here next Sunday if you want to read it. But basically, there are some things that the politicians know, that the big business people know about the mind and how most Americans think. And once you know how somebody thinks, you got them. Number one, that Americans will never do anything not unless it touches them directly. They don't like for somebody to tell them that they are wrong, even if they know that they are wrong. There's about 6 or 7 things like that. I'll bring the book to church next Sunday. If any of you is interested to see, what they say. So basically what it is that once you know the psyche or the psychology of an individual, it's very easy to manipulate them. They think that they're in charge, but they are not. You can tell the truth from now till kingdom come. All you have to do is introduce one of those things that, you know what, this is what is going on against you. It may not be true, but because people expect, they will believe that, yes, you are thinking the way I'm thinking. And that is how you manipulate people.
Interesting.
I think
Yeah,
it's
you'll
going
have to
on
bring it
now.
in.
Yes.
It's going on now.
If
Go
you,
ahead.
this is just reminding me of, how Indians and, some other communities in the country are thought to be privileged minorities, right? And they also vote and, have, lean in a certain direction.
Uh-huh.
And it's basically because, they come into the country with so much power and education that they don't identify with the immigrant community that really
Oh,
struggles
really?
otherwise, right?
I
And
didn't realize that. So
Yeah.
you're telling me something I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, please continue.
so that just reminded me of that, right? Like during this election, especially, we were supposed to talk about, but
Oh, that's okay. You can talk about it.
yeah, but everyone had all these ideas of, oh, it's good for business, free market will make like education better, like there'll be educational choices, and they really believe in it. But the truth is that it is some kind of dream that was sold to them, not just over here, it was sold to them when they were in India. And it's a certain class from India that
Wow,
can really
interesting.
afford to come here.
Yeah.
And so,
A lot of shifts taking place, huh? Our time is almost up. Does somebody have something else you want to share before we? And let's see. I had an idea.
All right.
I'm terrible. Well, I guess. One of my ideas were if we were to be like the early church, what would happen if we started teaching in ways that took the American myth and turned it on its head? How would that be received? What American myth, what would you say is probably the most prominent American myth that we have? That everybody would agree is American myth.
That we are elite.
And they're superior.
Freedom.
Yes,
Freedom.
Freedom.
Yeah, freedom. Haha.
yeah. I think one of the things that I thought of was rugged individualism. And of looking at that and saying, you know what, rugged individualism will kill you. There's no way in the world you can survive as a rugged individualist, not even as a mountain man. You can't do it that way. And then you talk about freedom. You talk about some of the other things that you said. The other thing, you were going to say something, John? No.
No, that's fine.
Okay. And some of the other American myths that we have, it would be interesting to turn those on their head and see what the response would be from people. Because I think people, was the bootstrap theory. People pull themselves up by the bootstraps.
Well, right.
And I love Dr. King when he said, well, that works just fine unless you don't have any boots.
That's right.
If you don't have a leg to put it on.
That's right.
That's right. So some very interesting ways that we could turn some of that. That's what the early church did, is they turned some of those Roman myths on their head, and that got people's attention and said, wait a second. Yeah. That could be true.
I think if there was a way just to do every little bit you can do to try to eliminate prejudice.
Mhm.
And I guess the example that I think of is I walked up to some asbestos workers in Australia who were sitting on a retaining wall having their lunch. I walked up to them. Of course, they had all their white suits on to do the asbestos abatement. So I walked up to them and I said, well, so how do you do your process? I mean, do you have air monitoring? And are they taking care of you as workers as far as not ingesting the asbestos? And they said, no, we have all the precautions and a lot of regulations and stuff they had to follow. And so then they looked at me and some of the workers and they said, no, why are you asking us that? I go, well, I'm an architect. And I said, I'm interested in seeing how you do it in your country. They go, why are you talking to us? And there's this class system like, oh, architects don't talk to the workers. They
Interesting.
don't talk to the workers. And I said, I don't understand. And we work together as a team. We're a team. We're not. And then I realized the class system that's in Australia.
Wow, I didn't know that either. I've never been to Australia.
This is unbelievable. And so, like, last 3 years, I've been doing a lot of work south of the Mason-Dixie line. And I'll go up to all the workers, every worker, the ones that are Honduran and Chilean and stuff. Some of them I can't talk to them because I don't know Spanish, but the ones I can talk to that say we're all human beings. All human beings. To cut the prejudice, it's such a terrible thing.
I would note that one of the sort of approaches to American history especially that the Christian right is into, that they would like to return to, is the idea that our whole history is just one of great men, aka white men, and so forth, and that and it's a glorious history, and that's what we should be teaching. Don't worry about the common people, don't worry about the slaves, etc. And that still is a very pervasive evidence.
Yes.
So I agree. We need to flip things over and say, wait a minute, our country is made of people.
Sure. I have to tell you the story that I saw on TV. Some of you might have seen it too. And our president had said that he wanted to be on Mount McKinley. Yeah, I'm not sorry. Sorry, Mount Rushmore. His image on Mount Rushmore. And so I think I can't remember what show it was on, but anyway, they went down to the beach in Virginia Beach or somewhere down there, and they started interviewing people, and they said, okay, we want to know, should his image be on Mount Rushmore? And they said, oh, yeah, be okay. Yeah, sure, that sounds good. They said, could you tell us where Mount Rushmore is? Not one of them. Not one of them. I can tell you the state Mount Rushmore was like. And then the person asked, I think this was on Jimmy Kimmel or something. But yes, but then the second question was, who's on Mount Rushmore?
Yes.
And, George Washington, they got. Teddy Roosevelt, yeah, not so much. Lincoln, yeah, he did something, But who was that other guy? The one woman, the one said, yeah, he's the good-looking one, right? He's the good-looking one.
Yeah.
Alexander Hamilton. I don't think so. Oh my God. Oh, part of that whole question of prejudice is ignorance, isn't it? It's ignorance. I mean, because once you really start looking at one of the things I love about multiculturalism is I don't know anything about a lot of the cultures. And people can teach me stuff and it's cool. It's amazing. But if you don't open your mind to it, it's like Bruce does say all the time when he comes back from one of his excursions, you have a different way of looking at life. And that's life.
I just started reading the book the last week,
Yes.
and I'm taking like 3 pages at a time here, trying to seep it all in. And it's based on 3 things. Political oppression is number 1.
Oh, yeah.
Economic exploitation is number 2.
Absolutely.
And then it's all legitimated by religion.
Mhm.
So, and that was 2,000 years ago, and here we are, the
Doing it
same
again.
thing today. So,
Sure are.
how do we break out of it? By making a stand,
That's
saying, we need to stand up and say something.
And it's hard to do.
Yeah,
That's
it
why
is.
people
Yes.
don't do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they're also afraid of being hurt or somebody's going to come after them or, But if we don't, then this is what happens.
There was another Jimmy Kimmel thing, and I have to say this one too, because we even asked Heavenly about this, where they were asking people how to address a letter. Where you put the
Oh,
address.
yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
Where you put the stamp. And most all of them did not know how to address a letter. These were adults. And one of the girls they asked, and they said, "And what do you do?" She said, "Well, I'm a student at Harvard."
Wow.
Uh-huh.
I said, "Heavenly, get it in here." How do you address a letter? Oh, you put the address here, return address, and stamp. I said, "You could go to Harvard."
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?